When Jacob Wilson, a black officer, cracked a high-stakes bank robbery case, he didn't just expose a dangerous gang. He uncovered the deep-rooted racism in his own department. Betrayed and mocked by colleagues, his next move shocked the entire community. But let's start from the beginning. Jacob Wilson had spent over a decade serving with distinction in the bustling city police force, building a reputation for his keen investigative instincts and unshakable moral compass. When the opportunity arose to transfer to a suburban department on the outskirts of a major city, he saw it as a chance to step away from the high-pressure environment and settle into a quieter community. However, his arrival was anything but smooth. From the moment he walked into the precinct, Jacob could feel the tension in the air. His new colleagues greeted him with tight-lipped smiles and sidelong glances. Whispers followed him down the hallways, punctuated by bursts of laughter that stopped whenever he entered the room. They soon gave him a sarcastic nickname, Hero of the Day, a thinly veiled jab at his decorated city record. During briefings, his input was met with exaggerated eye rolls or outright dismissal, no matter how insightful his observations were. Despite their blatant hostility, Jacob maintained a calm professional demeanor, determined not to let their behavior derail his commitment to serving the community. Then came the bank robbery. The crime was audacious, a midday heist at the town's central bank involving masked gunmen, terrified hostages, and a dramatic getaway. It sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community, where serious crimes were rare. At the precinct, the atmosphere buzzed with urgency as officers scrambled to piece together leads. Yet, when Jacob offered to assist, he was met with sneers. "Better stick to patrolling, Wilson," one officer said with a smug grin, his voice dripping with condescension. "This one's above your pay grade." The words stung, but Jacob bit back his frustration, unwilling to give them the satisfaction of seeing him react. Despite being effectively sidelined, Jacob resolved to contribute in his own way. He began reviewing the surveillance footage, poring over witness statements, and scanning police records. His years of experience had taught him to look beyond the obvious, to search for the small but telling details others might miss. Sure enough, his meticulous review unearthed clues. A faint tattoo on one suspect's wrist, a peculiar getaway route that suggested familiarity with the area, and a striking similarity to a pattern of robberies in his old district. Each discovery added to Jacob's growing sense of purpose. Though he felt isolated within his new team, he knew the importance of pushing past personal grievances for the sake of justice. Determined to prove his worth, not for his colleagues, but for himself, Jacob prepared to present his findings, knowing it might be the key to solving the case. As the department floundered to make progress on the high-profile bank robbery, Jacob kept his head down, silently working through the mountain of evidence piling up. Surveillance footage, dismissed by others as too grainy, caught Jacob's trained eye. He rewound and replayed the clips, analyzing every frame. That's when he noticed it. A small jagged tattoo on one of the suspect's wrists, barely visible under the sleeve of a jacket. To most, it would seem insignificant, but to Jacob, it was a flashing beacon. The tattoo triggered a memory from his years in the city force. It matched the symbol of a gang infamous for orchestrating high-stakes heists, often crossing state lines to avoid detection. Their methods were precise, their leadership ruthless, and their members notoriously difficult to track. Jacob's pulse quickened as he combed through his mental catalogue of past cases. He knew he was onto something. Brimming with confidence, Jacob compiled his findings into a clear, detailed report. The gang's modus operandi, the suspect's potential identity, and connections to previous crimes painted a vivid picture. When he presented it to his supervisor, Sergeant Dawson, Jacob anticipated at least a modicum of interest. Instead, Dawson dismissed him with a withering glare. "We don't need a rookie detective on this," Dawson snapped, leaning back in his chair. "Stick to your beat and let the professionals handle it." The rebuke stung. Jacob clenched his jaw, holding back the urge to defend himself. The casual dismissal wasn't new, but this time it carried heavier consequences. His evidence could be pivotal, and it was being disregarded out of prejudice and ego. Instead of pushing back, Jacob resolved to continue on his own. Late into the night, he pored over records from both the suburban department and his previous precinct. drawing on his connections in the city to fill in gaps. His persistence paid off. A name emerged: Darren Smokes Carter, a known member of the gang, whose previous arrests included a robbery eerily similar to the current case. The connection was undeniable, but Jacob hesitated. He knew the gravity of what he had uncovered and the importance of acting swiftly, yet the thought of facing more ridicule from his colleagues made him pause. Would they even take him seriously? Could he withstand another round of their scorn? Taking a deep breath, Jacob pushed his doubts aside. This wasn't about earning their approval. It was about justice for the victims. With that resolve, Jacob prepared to share his findings, knowing that what he uncovered could turn the tide of the investigation. At the next department meeting, Jacob walked in with his case file under one arm and his resolve steady. As officers joked and casually sipped their coffee, he stood at the front of the room, cleared his throat, and began his presentation. "Over the past few days, I've been looking into the robbery at Central Bank," Jacob began, his voice firm despite the skepticism that rippled through the room. A few officers exchanged smirks, but Jacob pressed on, flipping through slides of surveillance stills and case notes. He pointed to the faint tattoo visible on the suspect's wrist. "This is a symbol linked to a gang known for orchestrating high-stakes robberies across state lines. Here's what ties them to our case." Jacob detailed his findings with precision: the timeline of the robbery, connections to previous crimes, corroborating witness statements, and records tying a suspect to a known gang member. He laid it all out, undeniable evidence that the gang was responsible. The room, which had started with muffled whispers and dismissive glances, grew quieter with each point he made. By the time Jacob concluded, his colleagues were leaning forward in their seats, their expressions a mix of disbelief and reluctant admiration. Even Sergeant Dawson, who had barely masked his disdain for Jacob, seemed stunned into silence. After a pause, he gave a grudging nod. "Looks like you've got something here," he admitted, though the words were clipped. The department acted quickly on Jacob's findings, organizing a raid to apprehend the suspects. But when the assignments were handed out, Jacob's name was conspicuously absent. "We've got enough people on this," Dawson said when Jacob questioned it. "You've done your part. Let the rest of us handle the heavy lifting." Jacob bit back his frustration, watching as his colleagues, many of whom had doubted him just hours earlier, geared up for the operation. Left behind at the station, he monitored the raid through radio updates, his heart pounding with a mix of pride and frustration. When the operation concluded with the successful capture of the gang members, Jacob couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. His work had been instrumental in bringing them to justice, and he took solace in that. But his elation was short-lived. At the press conference held to announce the arrests, Jacob stood in the back of the crowd, watching as his colleagues, officers who had belittled him, stood in front of the cameras, taking credit for the investigation. No mention was made of Jacob's contributions. His name wasn't even acknowledged. The injustice of it all burned, but Jacob held his head high. He knew the truth of what he had done. Though his efforts were overshadowed, he had delivered justice, and that, above all, was what mattered. Still, a part of him wondered, would he ever be given the respect he had earned? What Jacob's colleagues failed to realize was that he had been quietly documenting everything from the beginning. Every dismissive comment, every overlooked email, every instance where his contributions were disregarded. He had it all meticulously recorded. From his initial presentation of evidence to the press conference, where others took credit for his work, Jacob had maintained a comprehensive record that painted a damning picture of bias and misconduct within the department. When a local reporter, digging deeper into the department's handling of the bank robbery case, stumbled upon discrepancies in the official narrative, Jacob decided it was time to act. He reached out with his documentation, providing an unflinching account of how the investigation had unfolded and how systemic prejudice had nearly derailed the pursuit of justice. The story broke like a thunderclap. Headlines highlighted the contributions of the sidelined officer who had cracked the case while exposing the toxic dynamics within his department. Community leaders and activists demanded accountability, organizing protests and speaking out against the entrenched culture of discrimination in law enforcement. The story went viral, sparking conversations far beyond the suburban town. Within weeks, an internal investigation was launched. Emails and meeting notes corroborated Jacob's claims, and the department faced severe backlash for its failure to recognize and support one of its most competent officers. Sergeant Dawson and several other officers were disciplined or dismissed for fostering a hostile work environment and compromising the integrity of the investigation. Jacob, on the other hand, became a symbol of perseverance and professionalism. Local residents and leaders lauded him for his unwavering commitment to justice, even in the face of relentless adversity. His story inspired reforms within the department, including mandatory bias training, revamped protocols for case handling, and a renewed focus on creating an inclusive and supportive environment for all officers. Though Jacob felt a sense of validation, his victory was bittersweet. The journey had taken a toll on him, exposing the depths of prejudice within a profession he had dedicated his life to. Yet, the ripple effects of his bravery were undeniable. The changes he sparked within the department and the broader community offered a glimmer of hope for the future. Standing outside the precinct one evening, Jacob reflected on his journey. The road had been long and arduous, but he had remained true to his values. In the end, his commitment to justice had not only solved a major case, but also illuminated a path for meaningful change. It was a small but significant step toward creating the kind of community he had always sworn to protect.